I knew I was done the second I saw the reflection in that glass wall, me standing there in my worn blazer, clutching a notebook, and him, sprawled in the CEO's chair like he'd been born into it. The kid wasn't even the CEO. He was the CEO's nephew, freshly imported from whatever frat house he'd been haunting, and apparently he thought running a 15-year veteran out the door was his rite of passage. He didn't motion for me to sit. He just leaned back, crossed his arms, and smirked like a man about to deliver a line he'd been practicing in the mirror all morning. Be grateful for your last $3,800 paycheck, he said, dragging out the numbers like he was savoring the taste. It hit me in the gut, not because of the money, but because of the precision of the insult. $3,800, not $4,000, not even a rounded number. He wanted it small, deliberate, something that screamed, "You're not worth a full month's dignity." And he said it loud enough for the admin outside to hear. My 15 years of designs, late nights, and the kind of solutions that had kept the company afloat during two separate crises, all reduced to a sarcastic pat on the head. I didn't flinch, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I looked at the check like it was a coupon for free fries and slipped it into my folder. A nod. Thanks for letting me know, and I was already halfway out the door. By the way, small break here. I don't usually say this, but apparently 97% of people who listen to stories like this don't actually subscribe. Wild, right? If you're in that 97%, hit that button. Keeps the team caffeinated enough to dig up the good ones. I passed 3 coworkers on the way to my desk, each suddenly very interested in their screens. One pretended to cough into a coffee cup. Another started typing like he was trying to set a new world record. Nobody wanted to be associated with whatever execution just happened in the glass box. The nephew had that effect, smug confidence, that came from never having had to fix a single real problem in his life. At my desk, I opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the cardboard box I'd hoped I'd never need, and started filling it with my life's work in desk form. The framed photo of the founder shaking my hand after my first big patent approval. The mug my old team got me that said design which in crooked letters. The small stack of prototype sketches I'd kept, not because I needed them, but because they reminded me why I ever cared about this place. Through the corner of my eye, I saw him stroll past. "Tough break," he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Nothing personal, just saving the company money." And then he winked, like we were in on the same joke. What he didn't know, and what I didn't bother to correct, was that the founder and I had made sure, years ago, that I'd never leave here empty-handed. Back when the company was still hungry, when it was just a dozen of us sweating through endless problem-solving sessions, the founder had leaned across his cluttered desk and said, if they ever try to cheapen you, they cheapen themselves out of business. Then he slid a piece of paper across to me. A clause. A strange, oddly specific clause that made me laugh at the time. Now, as I placed my sketchbooks in the box, that clause was burning a hole in my memory. I'd kept my own signed copy of the contract at home, tucked in a safe place, not because I thought I'd need it, but because the founder had once said, "One day you might." I taped the box shut, lifted it onto my hip, and walked through the office like I was just another Friday layoff. Nobody said a word. The air was thick with the kind of silence people make when they don't want to get caught looking. I didn't need them to say anything. I had the only words that mattered already etched in my head, the exact line that would flip this smug little firing into the most expensive mistake the nephew, and this company, would ever make. When I reached the elevator, I caught my own reflection again. Same blazer, same steady expression. But behind my eyes, a different story entirely. I wasn't walking out of here defeated. I was walking out holding a lit fuse. I moved through my desk like I was performing surgery, slow, deliberate, making sure every small thing I wanted came with me, and nothing I cared about got left behind for them to toss in the dumpster. The hum of the office felt wrong, louder in its silence. No one met my eyes. People I'd trained, mentored, defended in meetings, now glued to their monitors like their lives depended on whatever spreadsheet or email they were pretending to work on. It wasn't personal. They were just hoping they wouldn't be the next one called into the glass box. The nephew made his second appearance of the day, strolling past my cubicle with that same swagger that made you want to hit mute on his existence. He slowed just enough to rest his hand on the divider, leaning in like we were conspirators in some harmless prank. "Hey," he said, voice pitched low but not low enough. "Nothing against you, it's just, trimming the fat. Gotta save the company money." He said it like he was telling me we'd run out of cupcakes at the staff party. I didn't give him the glare he deserved. I just slipped the last of my notebooks into the box and sealed it shut with a strip of tape. His cologne, too much of something that cost more than his watch, lingered a second longer than he did. As he walked away, I caught him muttering to one of the sales guys, "Saved us a fortune today." I let the words sink in, not as an insult, but as a receipt. The smell of printer toner and burnt coffee was pulling me backward, not to today, but to 15 years ago. Back when the founder's office was a cramped, paper-stacked mess in the old building, before we'd moved downtown and started talking about market share and quarterly growth like we were Fortune 500. He'd been leaning over my shoulder, looking at the design that would eventually carry this company through 2 recessions. You realize, he'd said, tapping the blueprint, this is going to be the backbone of everything we make from here on out. I'd laughed, thinking he was just hyping me up. But he was dead serious. He called me into his office later that afternoon, sliding a mug of coffee across his desk, and said he wanted to tweak my contract. At first, I thought he meant more money. Instead, he pulled out a single sheet of paper with a clause so oddly specific, I thought it was a joke. This one's just for you, he said. You built this thing. If they ever try to cheapen you, they cheapen themselves out of business. We'd both laughed then, not realizing how sharp that line would sound echoing in my head 15 years later. I'd signed it without hesitation, figuring it was just a founder's sentimental gesture. But as I stood there now, with a cardboard box under my arm and the nephew's smug little cost-saving victory ringing in my ears, that clause felt less like sentiment and more like a loaded weapon I'd been carrying without knowing it. I took one last look at my desk, the space where I'd solved problems at 2 a.m., where I'd sketched ideas on napkins that later turned into million-dollar products. It was stripped bare now, just beige laminate and a tangle of cables. They'd think I was walking out quietly. They'd think this was over. But the truth was, I'd already started writing the ending in my head. And when it came, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be expensive. I didn't look back when the elevator doors closed. By the time I hit the parking garage, the office was already just a stale memory I'd be erasing soon enough. The box of my things sat on the passenger seat, seatbelt strapped across it like I was driving home with something fragile. In a way, I was. The air outside was cold enough to bite, and I let the silence of the drive settle in, only the low hum of the engine filling the space where all the fake sympathy and half-hearted goodbyes had been. 10 blocks from the office, I pulled into my bank's drive-through, slid the $3,800 check into the tube, and watched it disappear like it was already someone else's money. That was the last thing they'd ever pay me on their terms. The deposit slip was still warm in my hand when I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in years, but always kept close. My lawyer, my real lawyer, not some cut-rate one-size-fits-all firm. This was the man who'd reviewed my first patent application, the one the founder and I had toasted over a decade ago. He answered on the second ring, voice steady and familiar. Haven't heard from you in a while. What's going on? I didn't waste time. Do you remember the founder's clause? I asked. A pause. You mean that oddball one about compensation thresholds? Exactly. I'm reading it to you now. I reached into the box and slid my personal copy of the contract from between two old project binders. The paper was a little yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still bold, each word a time capsule from the day we'd signed it. I read it aloud, word for word. If, at any point during the term of this agreement, the employee's monthly base pay shall fall below $4,000, all patents, designs, and intellectual property authored by the employee and currently licensed to the company shall immediately and irrevocably revert to the employee's sole ownership. When I finished, there was nothing but silence on the line. Then I heard him exhale, slow, deliberate. They're about to regret this. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way he said them. Measured, certain. The same tone he used years ago when he told me we had a watertight case against a competitor who'd tried to rip off my design. Back then, it was about protecting my work. Now, it was about owning their lifeblood. Send me a copy tonight, he said. Don't talk to anyone there. Don't post about it. Let them think you're gone. I'll start the paperwork. I agreed, and when the call ended, I just sat there in the driver's seat for a long moment, watching the world move on around me, people carrying takeout bags, a guy yelling into a Bluetooth headset, a teenager balancing a coffee on his skateboard. They had no idea that a mile away, company was still congratulating itself for saving $200 on my last paycheck, completely unaware they'd just sold me the keys to their kingdom for a discount. I slipped the contract back into its folder and set it gently on the seat beside me. It felt heavier than before, not like paper, but like leverage. The kind that could crack a boardroom wide open. This wasn't about a job anymore. This was about ownership, control, and I was already thinking about exactly how much it was going to cost them to get it back. By the time I got home, my lawyer had already emailed me a secure link to upload scans of the contract. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee, the kind of bitter, overbrewed sludge you drink when you're not after comfort, just fuel. Every page went into the scanner, my original signature, the founder's neat, slanted handwriting, and that one lethal paragraph sitting quietly in the middle of page 6 like an unexploded mine. 15 minutes later, the files were gone from my desktop, transferred to his encrypted archive. He called not long after. It's clean, he said. Everything's enforceable. We'll let the trigger activate automatically on the date. Don't contact anyone there. Don't hint at anything. Let them think they've won. The quieter you are, the deeper they'll sink before they see the trap. It was exactly the kind of advice I wanted to hear. I didn't need theatrics. I needed timing. The days that followed felt like watching a slow-motion car wreck, except I wasn't in the car anymore. The company's LinkedIn lit up with a polished post about successful cost-cutting measures and streamlining for future growth. The nephew's smiling face was front and center, quoted about making the hard decisions that keep us competitive. If he'd had the self-awareness of a potato, he might have noticed that cutting me loose wasn't going to save the ship, it was going to strip the engine out mid-ocean. But he didn't. He doubled down. I heard from a friend in accounting, one of the few still brave enough to text me, that he'd been spotted at a local bar, holding court like a war hero back from the front lines. He was bragging about slashing dead weight and freeing up cash for innovation, whatever that meant in his world. At one point, he apparently toasted the table with a whiskey glass and said, "Some people are replaceable. You just have to be the one willing to do it." Every word out of his mouth was digging him deeper. Not just with me, but with anyone who might eventually sit across from him in a boardroom when this all came crashing down. I didn't need to respond. I didn't need to defend myself. The beauty of a trap like this is that you let your opponent build their own walls, and then you make sure the exit is locked from your side. Meanwhile, my lawyer worked in the background like a chess player setting up a checkmate no one else could see coming. He drafted the patent reversion filings, the licensing fee schedule, even the retroactive invoice for continued use of my designs once the clause took effect. It was all dated, numbered, and ready to drop the moment the calendar rolled over. From the outside, it probably looked like I'd vanished. No angry posts, no calls to old colleagues, no rumors about a lawsuit. I was a ghost and they thought ghosts didn't bite. But I was watching every post, every smug update, every tone-deaf celebration. And the satisfaction in staying silent was its own reward, because I knew what they didn't. The second that clause triggered, their cost-cutting success would be the most expensive mistake in the company's history. The morning it happened, I woke up before my alarm. No anxiety, no dread, just that quiet alertness you get when you know something important is about to land in your lap. The date on my phone stared back at me like a finish line: 30 days since the $3,800 paycheck. 30 days since the Nephew smirk. 30 days since they unknowingly reached under their own foundation and loosened the load-bearing bolts. By mid-morning, my lawyer called. His voice had that almost playful calm I'd only heard once before, back when we'd won a patent dispute so decisively that the other side's lawyers didn't even bother showing up to the final hearing. "It's done," he said. "The clause is active. Everything on that list, the patents, the designs, the derivative works, it's all back under your sole ownership. I filed the formal notice with the patent office, and they've acknowledged receipt. Legally speaking, they don't own the backbone of their business anymore." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the sunlight pouring across my kitchen floor. For a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of how absurdly clean the whole thing was. No screaming matches, no courtroom drama, just a quiet flip of the switch. My mind pulled me back to the founder's office years ago, and this whole thing was just a hypothetical. He'd been leaning back in his chair, tie loose, staring at the first working prototype of the product that would change the company forever. "You know," he'd said, "people get cheap when they get comfortable. They forget what got them here. If they ever try to cheapen you, they cheapen themselves out of business." At the time, I'd smiled, thinking it was just a nice sentiment, a loyalty thing, but he'd been dead serious. Even tapped the contract with his pen and said, "This clause isn't for now, it's for later. You'll know when later gets here." Later was here. I opened my email and there it was, a clean PDF from my lawyer, subject line, confirmation of reversion of rights. My name bold at the top of the ownership line. Their company's name, now absent from everything that mattered. It was so simple it almost didn't look real. But it was. Every cent they made from those products, from that moment on, passed through a toll booth with my name on it. The strange thing was, I didn't feel the rush I expected. No triumphant music swelled in my head. No cinematic montage of revenge, just a steady, grounded certainty. The real strike wasn't today. Today was about reclaiming what was mine. The strike would be when they realized how much it was going to cost them to keep breathing through the lungs I'd just taken back. I closed the email, picked up my coffee, and looked out the window at the street below. People going about their business, unaware that a mile away, an entire company had just lost control of the one thing keeping it alive. I had the power now, and I wasn't going to waste it on making them squirm too soon. That part I wanted to savor. The fax went out just after lunch, one page, crisp and merciless. My lawyer had condensed months of potential legal wrangling into a single, airtight document, licensing fee schedule effective immediately. The heading alone was enough to make a CFO sweat. Below it, in clean bullet points, the terms were laid out like bricks in a wall they couldn't climb over. Annual licensing fee for continued use of all reverted patents, 7 figures, due at the start of each fiscal year. Retroactive usage fees, calculated from the exact date of my last paycheck, yes, the $3,800 one, right up to the present moment. Penalty interest for late payment, enough to make the finance department consider selling office furniture on eBay. There was no legalese to hide behind. No wiggle room. Just math and the brutal reality that without paying me, they couldn't make or sell a single unit of their flagship product. The fax machine on their executive floor spat out the page with its usual mechanical indifference. The nephew happened to be the one to pick it up. A receptionist later told me he barely glanced at it before smirking and saying, "Oh, this is cute," like it was some prank letter from a disgruntled ex-employee. He folded it in half and tossed it onto the corner of his desk, where it sat for a full 40 minutes. 40 minutes in which he bragged on the phone about how clean the layoff had been. 40 minutes in which he believed the game was over. Then the phone on his desk rang, direct line from the board chairman's office. Not his uncle, the CEO, the chairman, the man who'd been in the room with the founder when my clause was written all those years ago. "Bring that fax to me," the chairman said, his voice flat. The nephew, probably thinking it was a courtesy meeting, strolled down the hall with the paper dangling from his fingers. A junior assistant walking by swore she heard the door slam shut behind him. 10 minutes later, she heard raised voices. The chairman wasn't yelling, he didn't need to. That's the kind of man who could gut you with a whisper. But the nephew's voice kept climbing in pitch, like someone trying to argue their way out of a locked trunk. Inside that room, the board's legal counsel had already verified what the facts said. The patents were mine. The usage fees were enforceable. And without those patents, the company's assembly lines might as well be a row of idle lawn chairs. When the door finally opened, the nephew didn't strut out like he'd gone in. He looked pale, his phone clutched in one hand, the fax in the other, creased now from being gripped too tightly. He didn't head back to his office. He went straight to his uncle's, and the two of them stayed in there with the blinds drawn for the rest of the afternoon. I didn't need to hear what was said. I already knew. The trap had sprung, and for the first time since he'd sat in that glass office and smirked at me, the nephew understood that this wasn't about a paycheck. It was about ownership, and he just realized it wasn't his. The panic didn't start loud, it started with silence. The kind you only get in a boardroom when everyone is staring at the same document and no one wants to be the first to admit what it means. My lawyer told me later that the board's general counsel had read the facts twice, lips moving before finally looking up and saying, "This is airtight." From there, the scramble began. The patents weren't disputed. They weren't temporarily in question. They were mine, locked in under my name, fully registered with the U.S. Patent Office, and retroactively protected from the exact date of my last paycheck. It wasn't a gray area, it was a shut door. The operations VP ran the numbers in real time. Without those patents, the production line would have to stop within the week. No production meant no shipments. No shipments meant breach of contract penalties from every major client on their roster. The CFO, a man who could usually spin bad news into at least a tolerable quarterly update, just sat there rubbing his temple. The first wave of calls from clients came within hours. A medical devices supplier wanted to clarify some rumors they'd heard about product delays. A European distributor asked if they should postpone their marketing launch. By mid-afternoon, a key government client, one whose contracts could make or break the fiscal year, demanded written assurance that delivery dates would be met. Legal couldn't give it to them. That's when the smell of real fear settled in. I knew all this not because I was there, but because the updates flowed to me like a quiet stream from the people still loyal enough to pass them along. One text from my old project manager simply read, "They're losing it, you'd love this." Another came from a sales lead, "Nephew's hiding in his office. CEO's not answering calls. Whole place is vibrating." I didn't rush to check the news feeds or LinkedIn updates. I didn't need to. My phone buzzed enough with screenshots of half-baked "we remain committed" statements they were trying to push out to clients. It was all theater, and I knew the truth. Without my signature on a licensing agreement, they were dead in the water. Sitting in my living room, coffee in hand, I watched a neighbor's kid wobble down the sidewalk on a new bike. Somewhere downtown, multi-million-dollar operation was unraveling thread by thread because one overconfident heir thought saving $200 on my paycheck was a victory. The satisfaction I felt wasn't hot. It wasn't that rush of revenge you see in movies. It was cold, precise, like holding a scalpel and knowing exactly where to make the cut. They were scrambling now, but the real conversation hadn't even started yet. That would come when they picked up the phone, not to issue a statement, but to beg for terms, and I already knew what those terms would cost. The first call came to my lawyer's office just after 9 the next morning. It wasn't the CEO, and it sure wasn't the nephew, it was the board's appointed negotiator, the kind of smooth talker they roll out when they want to look calm while their hair is on fire. He made a polite introduction, complimented my long-standing contributions to the company's growth, then slid into his real reason for calling. "We'd like to make this go away quickly. A lump sum wired today in exchange for full rights back to the company. We can have the paperwork ready in an hour." My lawyer didn't even need to ask me. "The licensing agreement stands," he told him. "It's non-negotiable. The terms have already been drafted and sent. If you'd like to proceed, the first year's payment is due in advance, along with retroactive fees." There was a pause, long enough that I imagined the negotiator pressing a finger to his temple. "The number you've proposed is substantial," he finally said. "It's designed to be," my lawyer replied and ended the call. That was their polite approach. The next one wasn't. Just after lunch, my phone rang from a number I recognized instantly. I let it go to voicemail, and sure enough, a text came seconds later. Pick up. This is important. I considered ignoring it, but the truth was, I wanted to hear him squirm. When I answered, the nephew jumped right in. No greeting, no pleasantries. Look, I know we've had our differences, but you're about to sink the entire company. People's jobs are on the line here. I let him talk, not because I cared, but because I wanted every last drop of his desperation on the record in my mind. He tried a half-hearted appeal to our shared history at the company, as if we'd ever been on the same team. Then came the guilt trip, how this would hurt employees, families, investors. Finally, I cut in. Do you remember the last thing you said to me in that glass office? Silence. I didn't give him time to answer. You told me to be grateful for my last $3,800 paycheck. I am, because without it, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. He started to say something else, but I hung up. By that evening, my lawyer confirmed that the board understood exactly what they were facing. The licensing fees weren't just a hit. They were a recurring hemorrhage, millions every year, with penalties for late payment that could gut their operating budget. And it was all perfectly legal. The stakes weren't abstract anymore. This wasn't just about them writing me a check, it was about whether the nephew kept his cushy job, whether the CEO survived the next shareholder meeting, whether the company even made it to the end of the quarter without shuttering its core product line. They tried to play cheap. Now they were about to learn what expensive really looked like. The boardroom looked smaller than I remembered, though maybe it was just the way everyone inside seemed to be caving inward. The long, polished table was littered with untouched coffee cups, legal pads scribbled with numbers, and the faint smell of panic masked poorly by expensive cologne. The CEO sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, eyes bloodshot. To his right, the nephew pale still, his usual smirk replaced by the thousand-yard stare of someone who'd finally realized the wolf was inside the house. I didn't sit right away. I let the room take me in, the click of my heels against the floor the only sound. They'd expected my lawyer alone. Instead, they got me calm, composed, holding a slim leather folder like it was the fuse to their last stick of dynamite. Let's make this quick, I said, sliding the folder to the center of the table. Inside, the licensing agreement, the real one, the one that made their lump sum offer look like a kid's lemonade stand. Annual licensing fees, I began, my voice steady, in the low seven figures, paid in advance each fiscal year. Retroactive usage fees starting from the date of my last paycheck. Interest already calculated. Penalties for late payment as outlined in Section 4, and one final condition: all marketing materials, product packaging, and investor presentations will carry my name as sole patent owner. Permanently, a murmur went around the table. One of the older board members leaned forward. That last condition, non-negotiable, I cut in. You want the product, you want the patents, you acknowledge the source. My name is part of your brand now. Across from me, the CFO's pen tapped against the table, fast and nervous. This is a lot, he said quietly. I leaned back, unbothered. It's cheaper than shutting down your core business. The silence that followed was thick enough to chew. Finally, the chairman, stoic, unreadable, nodded once. Get the papers. It took less than 10 minutes for the assistants to return with printed copies. One by one, the board members signed, their pens scratching reluctantly across the paper. No one looked up at me. The nephew's signature was the last, his hand trembling just enough for me to notice. When the final page slid back across the table to me, I placed it neatly in my folder, stood, and offered the same small smile I'd worn the day he'd told me to be grateful for my last $3,800 paycheck. No speeches, no gloating. I turned, walked to the door, and left them sitting in the stale air of their own making. By the time I reached the elevator, the deal was already binding. And as the doors slid shut, I realized I wasn't just walking away with my patents, I was walking away owning the part of them they couldn't operate without. The same part they'd once thought was replaceable. Thanks for watching, you cubicle warriors. Hit that subscribe button. Unless you're my old boss, then you're on your own. Revenge of the coffee pot strikes again.